Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the final module of Operation Defend the North, where we will be discussing the escalation of cyber threats, secondary attacks, and the safe restoration of services at Northern Horizons. I'm joined by both my co-hosts Amit Chopra and Graham Berry. But before we dive into this module, Mark Dillon will provide us a short update that we've received from Northern Horizons that will set the context for this and our closing discussions. Mark, over to you.
Well, last time we spoke, the efforts to 31 customers, which would be your critical infrastructure, first responders, and communications, was underway. That has since completed, so those sectors are back up and running. We don't have any reports if there was disruptions or anything caused by the actual power restoration, because sometimes when you have a multiple day outage, there's equipment failures or other things that are unanticipated that happen. We don't know that yet. Work is started now to restore the secondary level, which is the primary corridors and the rest of the infrastructure and the municipalities and some of the larger customers, the private customers, and anyone that just happens to be along the contiguous path of the power restoration. But we do have some indications from the utility that their partners have noticed that there are attempts to attack them. That there seems to be some activity that's above and beyond the normal day-to-day attempts to compromise systems, specifically the ones that are connected over telecommunications with the utility itself.
Thank you for that, Mark. Graham, I'm going to turn to you first as my co-host, just to get some perspective from your side. This topic of the escalation of the threat, but also restoration of services. Why are these so important for us to go hand in hand at this point as we come to our closing moments?
Well, really, we don't want to restore too quickly without having a further understanding of what potential secondary attacks there could be or escalations. My big concern would be, if the attackers were that well funded to launch an attack of this size, what else are they capable of as we're progressing through an incident like this, and how that would impact our restoration across the province, really.
Thank you, Graham. And Amit, from your perspective, what are a couple of two priorities that we should be looking at here?
I think I'm echoing on what Graham said. I think we need to look at where our vulnerabilities are at the moment. Are we prone to some secondary attacks in certain services? Have we contained our threat mechanisms and the threat landscape? Has it been revisited? Do we feel confident enough that we are not going to be compromised again? And I think before that is all done, we should not be restoring our facilities.
Yeah. Okay. Dr. Ali, if I can bring you into this conversation, this is the first session that you've been a part of. You've been obviously following along and getting debriefed in terms of where we're at today. From your perspective, your knowledge of the AI components, your knowledge of the different TTPs that might be used in a nation-state attack, from a threat escalation perspective, what are some indicators that we need to be looking at that might determine that there may be further escalations?
Right. In terms of further delaying recovery, that is usually against the business needs. So what we normally find is there is a significant resistance working with the clients if we want to further delay the recovery. But at the same time, as the colleagues mentioned, it is important to have a good understanding that when we recover, what are the risks and what are the stones that we have not looked into, right? One of the important aspects here would be attempt for threat attribution. Because when we do attribution, we would get a better understanding of the potential actors and their capacities that could help us in further deep down on what else could be left, right, untouched. And at that stage of the recovery, that's where AI, especially when you look into the techniques like fuzzy machine learning that are combining the confidence of the estimates with the evidences, with the indications of compromise would come handy. So for example, using fuzzy machine learning based techniques could help the investigators to understand that what is the probability of different actors behind specific actions based on the observed IOCs, or in this case, maybe IOAs in the case of attacks, right? Because we are having IOAs and probably IOCs are coming from the threat intelligence team, right? But as we receive them, it would be good to just feed them to those kind of AI algorithm for attribution, look into the list of suggestions, and then task the team members to validate the estimation of the AI, which ones are more probable and which ones are not, and then look back like the analysts inside this process. As the analysts are collecting more information of what we have seen, what we have collected, IOCs and IOAs are coming, we would make the AI to give us a more accurate estimate of the attribution, and we can take it from there, the actions that can be taken.
Thank you for that. Mark, if I can turn this conversation to you right now, and Dr. Ali has suggested looking at IOCs and IOAs. At this point, the attribution piece, how important is that to the restoration efforts?
Provided it doesn't hamper further restoration, I think people they want their power back, and that appears to be what the utility and generation are going down, is restoring it, communication. Some of the activities we're talking about may not even be possible until after we restore it, but there is a significant risk, especially with us seeing additional attacks, that restoration will enable our adversaries as well. And I think attribution would help us figure out or predict the scope of what is going to happen next. Is this just someone's trying to do ransomware opportunistically that has nothing to do with the original attack, or is this a second stage in something that was planned out well ahead of time? That we obviously everyone's trying to remain vigilant, but we have talked before about how burned out people are going to be. We're coming on the end of the third day of regardless of creating shifts in schedule, some people probably work through it anyway.
Yep.
And so I think we are very vulnerable right now, and understanding the motivation would be very helpful at this point.
I want to go, very shortly bring in the team from Armis, Andrew and Michael, into the conversation. But before I do that, Ali Shahidi, if I can come to you, and Kush as well. Restoration aside, the threat of a secondary attack, how far more devastating can that be? And especially for the executives at the table to understand, there's this push, bring services back up, where we need to bring services back up safely. A secondary attack, how much more devastating could it potentially be?
Well, for sure, if they have been able to get into our systems, they are not going to just leave that easily. That's a reality. And as Dr. Ali mentioned and others, we are at the stage that we cannot just restore, because that restoration can be actually the point to their second entry into the environment. And for sure, they have some payloads elsewhere left for the next attack. Having said that, while we are doing the investigation, we are trying to get the systems up and running, because that's a high priority for the public side. I think we should do at least the minimum and the basics as a part of the recovery and restoration. For instance, we know that they might be in there, the bad actors and threat actors in there already. Enforcing password change, for instance, making sure that the privileged accounts are all looked after. Additional monitorings are put in place, telemetry against the systems that might be critical in there. So those are the basics that we can do at this stage, and then based on that we can at least have some sort of assurance that there is not going to be any lateral movements or vertical movements across the board within our network that might cause the secondary attack. But it can be devastating, because this time they do have a full understanding of our environment. They have done it, they know that, and they know that how we could probably we could restore them, we could our investigations. Now they might come back with another tactic that is going to TTP, that is going to be much more sophisticated and cost us more time and resources to get to where we are at.
Ali, thank you for that. And if I can have Andrew sort of chime in to this. One of the things that you were discussing yesterday in a lot of detail was the fact that you need intelligence into your assets, you need a lot of visibility into it, and you mentioned quite a few things. As we are working towards restoration, are there any other points of observability that you would recommend we need to have in place over and above what you had discussed yesterday? Andrew?
Yeah, thanks. Yeah. So definitely, right? So I got informed that it was an implant on some hardware, right? So firstly, review every new hardware. Go in your console, and review all new hardware that's been put in. The other thing about, if you look at power stations, a lot of them use what we call fuzzy logic for determining when the controls and what to kick in. I would start feeding all that to AI. There's a number of AI services. You can push that through and start looking for anomalies there, because if this hardware is out of function or returning different values or outside of range, and that's not normal, right? So whereas the fuzzy logic will help those controls, whereas putting some AI and putting that data into a number of different consoles to see if that works. The other part there, when you said that they're getting secondary attacks from different supply chains, that to me is it's really an expanded threat landscape, right? So if you think about the power stations today, they're doing all they can in their environment, and now they're getting hit from the other supply chain. So for me, it's like finding out what's the most important ones to keep up, and the other ones that aren't, I would say, hey, go to all those other supply chains and say, you need to, if we don't need you right now, disconnect, check your environment, then come back up. Right, because that part of escalation, we're in day 3, and people would be at their end of the tether, right? So the other thing there is, and I forget the person who said it, but made a good point about knowing the threat actor. If we understand who that APT group is, like if it was Scatter Spider, they like to do things like escalate an attack, like send 40 terabytes of porn and do different attacks and focus on what they're after. So this attack as well could be a number of different ones. It could be, hey, they're attacking from the side because the way to get into the organization is being closed out in the power station. That's great, and they're trying to escalate a different way. Then we know we're winning. But if they're taking the supply channel and us focusing on all that different supply chain coming in, then they may find another way that they've already got that they can escalate internally for that in that restoration. So we don't know which one is true in that case, but us finding that it was this hardware, that puts us in a really good driver position. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you for that. I just want to take this conversation a little bit further, and Kush, I want to bring it to you at this point. One of the concerns that we have in this scenario is if we turn it back on safely. What are some checks and balances that you're going to recommend at this point, at least 3 of them, that need to be in place before a full restoration of services?
I think so. If we look at the situation from a human perspective, right? First, then we always have to focus on Canadians. We have to focus on citizenship. So what is happening right now? Number one, loss of trust, because now there's a secondary attack. We've been telling people that we've been working on it. They received these messages, and now we're going to tell them, oh, by the way, there's another attack. So what I would suspect would happen is a complete loss of trust in the authorities. Now, as a result of that, what's going to happen is criminality is going to be rampant. You don't have enough law enforcement agents to look after the entire population, and then there's potential riots, and there'll be folks in certain neighborhoods banding together, right, to share and pool resources. So there will be quite a lot of chaos at this point in time, and from a cybersecurity perspective on what we need to do, checks and balances, we have to, I think, rely on our partners, because they have everything up. They have their infrastructure up. They have intelligence mechanisms that are stronger than ours. So number one, we need to take all the information and evidence data that we have and work with our intelligence partners, cross border, to vet it, right? So if there's a comfort level there on both sides, then we could potentially release that information after that check and balance is done. So that's, I would say, the key check and balance.
Lena, if I could bring you and Terry into the conversation right now, before such a mission critical set of services are turned back on. From a government perspective and a policing perspective, are there any processes that we need to be aware of? Any approvals or any checks and balances that from your side you would want to see before full restoration?
So I don't know that there's going to be any official ones. I mean, I obviously can't speak for the entire federal government, but obviously it has to be done in concert with everyone else to make sure public safety is at the forefront. My only concern would be in policing, we have this rule it's called 1+1. So if you search somebody, a target, and they have a knife, you have to assume that there's going to be a second weapon. So you're always looking for what the other part of it is. And unfortunately, distraction events are common. The other thing that we're finding or we're seeing trends of is what is actually the incident is not really the incident. I'm not technical, so I will preface that with I am not technical. But we are finding from our perspective is that just because it looks like this is the attack and this is the target and this is where the threat actor is going, doesn't mean that there isn't something else there, something else that gets left behind, something else they're going to be able to spark up as soon as something else is done, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I would absolutely agree with that. Attacks where ransomware appears to be a financially motivated attack, and the ransomware attack itself is simply to obfuscate the fact that it was exfiltration of sensitive information. So it was more of a cyber espionage motivated attack. However, it used other more commonly perceived attacks to sort of obfuscate that. Furthermore, just to sort of where our organization will be concerned about this, and often to that same theme of intended target and building upon, I think it was Roosbay that was talking about the supply chain, or where looking at the initial attack vector where a supply chain is involved, we would then start to be concerned about some of the previous examples where as power is being restored and connectivity is being restored in a crisis mode, we've seen in a number of regional scenarios where opportunistic hostile states will start to leverage misinformation for launching wider spread attacks. So as people are quickly seeking information and they're clicking on what they believe to be bulletins, it actually were droppers that would enable a lateral jump into other systems greater than just the power grid. But also going back to, I think what Armis was talking about with the supply chain was identifying if there was from the initial attack vector or any of the exfiltration through supply chain. So identifying common, if there was that element, what other key sectors utilize that similar, so we don't get another SolarWinds type of incident. Like I know where the threat actor is actually leveraging that common either software or hardware component vulnerability that is outside of the energy sector in another critical infrastructure. So, we're just recovering from a power outage, and now all of a sudden, whether or not there's a possibility that you're going to see issues with the water at the municipal level or some sort of other commonality thread where that secondary attack isn't necessarily directed again at the utility, but it's moving to a broader lateral movement externally.
And the other side of that too is with that is you have to appreciate that everything that is being done is absolutely being watched and viewed. So the likelihood that the threat actor is watching to see how we're going to respond is going to dictate to them what they will do next. And it may also inform them of how to do it better next time. Like, I hate to say this is a huge impact and this is negative and this is everything, but this may only be a trial run or a dry run, maybe not impacting Canada, maybe impacting one of our partners or a bigger country or a bigger impact. So you can't get away from the fact that the likelihood is they're going to watch what we do. And how do we get everything back up and running? And how do we try to check for them? And then in 6 months, a year, 2 months, 5 years, there's going to be a bigger attack, and all the things that we think we did great are going to be useless.
Yep, valid point. I'm going to go to Rachel Roosbay, and then I'm going to queue up Michael from Team Armis. Rachel.
Yeah, so another way of maybe thinking about secondary attacks, or another version of this, could be that it's people seeing an opportunity and kind of jumping on the bandwagon. So we've seen cases where there's a geopolitical conflict going on. There are, attacks, whether they're cyber or otherwise, and then people see that area is vulnerable, and so for political reasons, or I don't know, like hacktivism kind of reasons, or financial reasons, they go and follow up with a secondary attack. Another reality that we see often with ransomware is somebody goes in for the first attack, they collect all sorts of information, and then they sell that information, which leads to a second attack that capitalizes on what the first attacker found, right? So those are other kind of levers there. And also, just going back to the point that was raised about the importance of attribution, I also want to note that attribution can become important sometimes at a political level too, because once you can say with some degree of definitiveness that, or some degree of certainty that, this happened because of that actor or an actor in that country, there are political levers and military levers that can be pulled, whether it's through NATO, unilateral, like all sorts of things. So that's another kind of option there, and why attribution could be kind of in the best benefit of the investigators.
Thanks for that, Rachel. Go ahead, Terry Roosbay, and then we'll go to Mike.
I was just going to quickly say, from a federal perspective, when it comes to the cyber realm and speaking to the attribution, that's why the final say for foreign state attribution actually rests with the Government of Canada's Foreign Affairs. So GAC actually is the body who would have the final say when it comes to attribution, because if we are attributing an attack to an external foreign entity, it's going to be our Foreign Affairs Office and the political repercussions that are felt quite quickly and at the forefront. So just to that point.
Fair enough. Roosbay, your perspective, and I'll go to Michael.
So from the perspective of, great points in terms of secondary attack and possibility of it. From the perspective of a cyber leader who is not necessarily impacted by the cyber attack, but now is recovering from the power outage, my mind would be automatically on the possibility that we're hit as well, or we're next in line. So as power comes back up and everybody's anxious to get back to business, I would communicate and get buy-in to at least have a slow roll into going full production. Couple of challenges with that from the business side. Obviously, they want to get back to we're talking about financial institutions. As an example, they want to get the trading floor up. They want to get branches open, start serving customers and generating revenue. Internally, your DevOps, DevSecOps, they are already down for 3 days, potentially 4 or 5. They want to get back to getting things rolling, maintain velocity. Those are going to be the two main pressures, and those are the two things that are going to impact your cautious approach to going live and being back online. So those are the things to keep in mind.
Thank you for that, Roosbay. And I do have a couple of comments to make, but I'm going to turn it over now to Michael from Team Armis. Michael, if you can unmute, and I'll go on mute as well, please.
Yes, I'd like to make a comment about secondary attacks. The vast majority of the time, they are misdirection. Okay.
Yeah, you can continue, Michael.
Is that better? Yes, the vast majority of the time it's for misdirection. One of two things is happening. Either they're trying to achieve their objectives, which they have not fully been able to do, and the remediation efforts are curtailing that, or they are trying to hide the fact they have secondary and third mechanisms in place to maintain access to the environment that they have not used, and they are trying to misdirect the incident responders from actually finding that type of information. Another key component on attribution is not only does it help you identify the new tactics techniques, or not just new, but the capabilities of the threat actors themselves, but it also helps identify gaps in their capabilities also. So when you give an example, I've dealt with an APT group that you apply timeline analysis and the type of attacks they were doing, you notice there was certain gaps throughout the day. And we actually identified it was gaps in their they're performing prayer times at that time. And that really helped us achieve how we can mitigate and bring systems back online when we know the threat actors are actually not going to be online at that point in time, too. So those are a couple of key areas to think about. Another key area to think about also is your incident responders are going to be at the end of their ropes. It's going to be third day into it. They're going to be tired. You need to test their assumptions and the evidence that they're seeing. And when you step back, take a look at the assumptions that they're making, pull them away from the keyboard for a little bit, bring in some other people that can bring a fresh perspective into it. Take a look at the evidence together, not on the keyboard in a separate room from everything. That helps really clear their minds, identify gaps that they're missing in their analytical approaches to see things that maybe the threat actors have done that they're missing too.
Appreciate that perspective, Michael. Octavia, you had something to add?
Yes, I did. I agree on the attribution, but one of the things that we understand the motivation behind the threat actor, and really have we really looked at what we believe the purpose is. And I agree with Michael. The people who are looking at that motivation should not be the same people who's been working on the keyboard for 3 days, right? Because you're kind of burnt out. Another thing is understand all the gaps. Like before we actually bring up to recovery, we have to understand our gaps, understand the assets and the vulnerabilities that's within those systems. We should not bring those systems back up the same way that they went down. So that means we're changing passwords, we're actually patching, we're fortifying endpoints, we're actually reviewing all of the vulnerabilities, reviewing all of the access points, reviewing everything that's coming and trying to figure out what we can actually do to fortify the systems before we actually bring them back up. Because I agree with what Terry said. We don't know if it's kind of a misdirection or if it's something staged for a secondary attack. What we would need to do is to ensure that every possibility, we try our best to actually block them out and still have the business run, right? And so we need to make sure that we're bringing those back up. And then understand what access the threat actors may have had when they actually was in the systems, and what other lateral movement could happen. With that access, then we need to go to that secondary system and do the same thing. So there needs to be a full review of the entire infrastructure before we actually recover.
I know, Kelly, you wanted to add something, then we'll go to George and then to Alicia Healy. Kelly.
Yeah, just building on the conversations around a secondary attack. It may not be the same company. It may not be the same geography, right? This, to some of the earlier comments, this could have been the test. And so to be prepared that if this same type of attack happens somewhere else, I think there needs to be a conversation before we bring everything up of what happens if this now is another province, another state, another country. Will we come back down, or will we assume we're safe and let them deal with whatever their problem is? So those conversations need to happen before the restoration, so it's not done in a panic. What will we do if there's another attack on us or on another geography? And then the other thing about restoration is, whether we know the intent or not, we need to think about the internal controls that we had in place, the internal controls that we missed, and then the restoration timeline. If this ever happened again today, tomorrow, next week, next year, what do we do to make that restoration timeline shorter?
Fair enough. George?
This might be a little bit technical for some people, but the actual team, to build on Octavia's point, that conducts the review, it can't just be a non-technical person who happens to be a physical security expert. It can't just be like the project manager who happens to be there at that moment. You have to have a team of experienced senior architects combined with someone who, or a team of people who are your IAM people, right? So typically, if we're looking at, potentially some kind of compromise, kind of vulnerability that was exploited, you have to then look at, okay, we're going to bring the system back up, architect this correctly. we can improve on a threat detector, where we're actually going to bring ourselves back to operation. When we talk to the IAM specialist, because I think it should be segregated, the IAM specialist is going to be like, hey, this is how things were exposed before. This is how we were exploited before. We need to try a new methodology. We need to find some other way to attain authentication so that we're sure that the right people have access to that environment. I think a lot of times in these crisis situations, because of a lack of resources, we just throw anybody who might know a shred of a thing at the problem. But for these sensitive critical systems, you have to have the actual experts, and it has to be the right expert with the right knowledge conducting the review before it gets put back into play.
Thank you for that, George. Ali Shahidi, you wanted to add to that?
Rudra brought up a good point when we are bringing from the ones that, from basically not the power generator organizations or entities, the ones that they have been down, and let's say the other organization entities that they are bringing up their own systems. One area else that we need to look after that is going to be the relationships and doing a health check on the partners. In day one, we assumed that there was an interruption in the communications between the, let's say, MSSPs and all of those organizations. We don't know what happened on their sides, and we don't know whether they have opened any side doors to that environment that can lead into our environments coming in if we are making the connections back with them. So we need to make sure that that basically the checks are done with them too, making sure that whatever during that time, whatever they have been doing and whatever how they brought their own systems back up, they are going to basically follow the same type of minimum standards that are going to protect us from this side, and again, not opening any backdoor side doors to our environments, because that might be the case. And such attacks usually in such a scale might have, although the power generators and the power was maybe the utilities were the target here, but as we talked, the attribution and maybe the other agendas behind the scene, why it happened, and how they had other targets that they used this opportunity to as a basically again just misinformation part, and redirecting the focus from what they really wanted to achieve to the power and all of those factors rather than the actual goal that they are trying to achieve.
Thank you for that, Dr. Ali.
Yeah, I'm just taking it from where George started the conversation, and it could be a little bit technical, but let's do it. Usually when we go to restoring services, we at least do 3 checks: tickets, accounts, access, right? So do you have tickets that have been generated that is not linked to any account that you know? That will be the first sign to not restore. Do you have accounts that suppose not to be there, but they are there? So do not restore. And then for the existing accounts, does the access that they have or access that they made make sense with their profile, with their behavior, right? So these are like usually the 3 minimum sanity checks that the incident responders are doing: ticket, accounts, access, right? But going beyond that, on the secondary movements, we are now dealing with adversaries that have learned from the environment. And we need to consider the impact of our learning when we do the risk assessment. That is something that is missing in many organizations that have been compromised in their risk assessment. You would see that adding another set of controls or another layers of the controls could be helpful. But if we are not conducting the risk assessment with the assumption that the attackers are now knowing XYZ from our environment, would most probably allow them to come back and would not make the mitigation strategies effective, right? So that's where you would see that a lot of advisories or technologies or even AI can help you in terms of remodeling your defense in depth, your layers, right? So assuming that the actors are now knowing this information from your environment, how are you going to assess your risk again, right? Again, different adversaries, same or with different capabilities. And so my last point here is in terms of attribution. it could be for most of us, except Terry here, perhaps, right? It could be less important that which foreign country or which foreign actors is behind this activity, but more about what are the capabilities that actor has, regardless of where they are coming from or what they do, right? So from the attribution, usually what I found is very important during recovery and the second waves is making sure that the attribution can be made in relation to TTPs, tactics and procedures of the adversary. If that link can be made, we can leave the rest of it to the foreign affairs to just take care of the rest, but we would be done from the security point of view with our actions.
Terry, do you want to respond?
No, it's a great point. That understanding that attribution within the technical realm being, very key, because it speaks to, the communications internally is one thing. It's that attribution externally where then it becomes problematic. So knowing that internal attribution, as partners with Armis and yourself are saying, that feeds into understanding the adversary, understanding the potential vulnerabilities and overexposure. So, and that's to our point as well. Those are key takeaways for us as well, as we're trying to gain larger picture understandings of the adversary, because then it's like, that's when the government agencies are looking at, okay, where does this fit into maybe a larger strategic picture of secondary attack? So a secondary attack may not be, timely now, but how does that factor into the future? That then starts to feed into identification of potential secondary attacks. Those technical forensics that are all being determined now during crisis are going to be critical proactively for those prevention potentially of secondary attacks in different geographic locations or whatever, from a larger geopolitical strategic perspective. That then becomes the role of the government agencies after incident response. That's often how our organization is involved, is the vital collection of that lessons learned, those forensics post crisis. Leave you guys to do all your crisis incident response. The Canadian Centre for Cybersecurity, great resource to assist with all of that and bring to bear their understanding of some of the external themes and or campaigns, and then how that can help with that internal attribution. Again, that's feeding to the internal attribution, not an external publicly disclosed attribution, which doesn't necessarily need to take place, right? There isn't necessarily a need to inform the general population. They don't care what hostile state potentially brought down or what non-state actor did it. It's vital for the incident response. All they care about is, all right, is there going to be secondary attacks? Do we need to consider other preparations? Is this a sign of a larger attack? No. Okay, this is an isolated incident. It's under control. Bang. The attribution externally then is like virtually non-necessary, in my humble opinion.
Thank you, Terry, for that. We have about 5 more minutes to go, and I want to bring Andrew from Team Armis back into the conversation, and then I'll go to Suman, and then for some closing comments from my co-hosts on this. Andrew, from your perspective right now, once services are restored and back to as close to regular capacity, where would you be focusing your monitoring activities? Where would you be focusing your attention in terms of what should the utility companies be looking at to ensure that nothing secondary transpires?
Yeah, I think it's a soft gloves approach when you bring back on, right? So it's all the different controls, IDS, IPS, firewall, right? As I said, looking at those fuzzy logic for those controllers, looking at all the supply chains coming in that you're not looking at, right? Guaranteed, no one's looking at the 10,000 supply chain they've got today, right? So it's putting soft gloves onto those as well, right? Making sure that this is not normal. What is normal? Right, it's people going through all those logs, looking through what is normal, what is not normal. The other part there I'd like to say is that also for attribution, when you come in an incident, it's usually the last thing you find out, right? Right. So the most important thing is the containment, the push out, and then keep it running. So my thing there is, but sometimes the tactics, you can see what it is and know who they are early. But the other thing there, what we're seeing threat actors do is they're selling their access to other threat actors. So the original ones come in and they just start farming it out. Oh, you can make a lot of money from doing exfiltration of data. So stress, instead of just having one threat actor you're against, you're having a lot more. So if this is a farm out to other threat actors, we're going to see a lot more opportunistic attacks in that supply chain, right? And once one person finds out a vulnerability and that's lucrative, then the others go for that. So Octavio, I think she said before, rightly so, once again, it's starting to contain and improve your defense. So if you can take that vulnerability out in the first place, you're left to boom. You're not getting attacked with that again in the next few days, right? So while you have things down and can patch and test in that process, that's a key part. And I think that's what you said there was totally well forward for that, right? So if we have to bring things up, let's fix them, let's test them, and then make sure they're more secure. And a lot of organizations have, they have networks that aren't the networks today are flat, right? They're not segmented well, or they could be better micro segmentation. So the other part there is, where can you put in that segmentation that only this system that you know of record can talk to this system? So understanding that threat landscape, putting those things in, putting those controls, making sure that they're monitored, and where possible, put more detections. If you look at organizations today, they don't have as many detections as they can, right? One, because the SIM tools can't handle hundreds and thousands of detections, but usually organizations today send stuff to a data lake. So I would be getting your best people to start looking through those data lakes, looking through the SIMs, looking through all the logs, and guess what? You'll find other attacks before that point in time. So the other part there is, when you can go back to that point in time, when it really happened, when they really put that hardware in, they really did that, then you've got a better understanding of what other things they did. Because at the moment we're blind, we think, hey, this is the attack. We don't know if there's other parts, already technical subterfuge in that environment they could take advantage of. So it's once again, spend that, PIR, post-incident review, and keep at it until you're 100% sure.
Thank you for that, Andrew. Suman, I'll bring a closing comment to you. Suman, listening to all of this and the procedures to restore services, etc., from your perspective, how does this now change the testing that you think we need to do in the utilities environment? And going forward, any 2 action items that you would take forward from this in terms of how we not only continuously monitor, but continuously test to prevent future attacks?
Yeah, that's a great point. We had a real quick conversation here on recovery, and it sounds easy, but it's probably very, very hard. And once we have gone to the point of recovery, there needs to be review. Is that root cause really the root cause? What's the ecosystem that's involved with this? And, where are those other vulnerabilities? We heard that in the conversations today. So it's going to be important to continually, it's not one and done. There's new vulnerabilities, there's new and changing tactics. So, there was a vulnerability that caused this issue to happen in the first place. And it's not just because you fix that vulnerability, it's all fixed. It's making sure that systemic or endemic things that are happening around this is also addressed.
Thank you very much for that. So with that, we come to the closing comments. I'm going to turn it over to Graham very quickly. From a restoration perspective, what do you think is going to be, besides everything that we've heard, one major challenge?
Coordination is going to be huge. It's hard enough in just one organization to perform a restoration, but when you compound it and spread it across tens of thousands of organizations, it's going to be a tall order. I look at this from a perspective of everyone's tired. If municipalities all the way up to the federal level have states of emergency in place, then there's processes to wind those down, and working with volunteer organizations that have helped in the communities. If this type of scenario happened and we had some sort of an extreme weather event like heat or cold, we'd be having a different conversation. There'd be a lot more loss of human life, and there would be a more public impact than we're already talking about now. So I think restoration is a big thing. There'll be a lot of discussion and, what could we have done better, and at all levels, even in small business.
Thank you for that, Graham. And Amit, just from your perspective, one key challenge or concern that you have going forward into the restoration services?
Yeah, I think I would not call it a challenge, but I think a work in progress more of a thing. Restoration is not cannot be defined. Restoration is not when the services come back up that we have restored, everything is up and running. Restoration actually means that we continue to be up, and that continuous process would require a lot of mechanisms in place for our RCAs to be in place, for us to revisit what happened, revisit periodically, frequently on those things, and sort of check our vulnerabilities over time, over and over again, to ensure that nothing of that sort is happening again. And I think that's what restoration would mean over a course of maybe few years. That's when we would essentially be able to say that we have restored our services, even though things have been working over time and reliably. And as everybody has said, and especially when Lena said, there is always 1+1 rule to that. We need to focus on that +1 right now, and it's not easy to eliminate. It's very easy to eliminate the first one, but the second one is always the tough part. So thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Amit. And with that, I want to say a big thanks to Team Armis for joining us and pushing through and giving us their perspective, and for everybody else around the table. This was our final session, our final module. We'll be back very, very shortly for a very quick 15-minute closing, and that will bring us to the end of Operation Defend the North. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. Cheers.